Hey guys, I'm Amira and welcome to Open Up. This is your communication podcast and I am your host, also known as the communication expert. I'm your podcast host, your life coach, and also a speaker. Each and every single week, I'm going to be bringing you conversations to help you level up the way that you communicate, whether that's with yourself or in your relationships. Through each conversation, you're going to leave with food for thought, skills that you didn't know you needed, and ways to develop your relationships. So join me here as you learn the lessons that you didn't get to learn at school. Pull up a seat and join us as we open up. Welcome, guys, to another episode. Wherever you are joining, wherever you are listening, if you are brand new and you have just landed on this episode, maybe somebody sent it to you. Now we're actually coming to the end of season 5, so we've got a few more episodes, but I think this is my penultimate solo episode, which I have zero idea where this whole entire episode has gone, this season even. But I also have to say the love on this season has been unmatched. You all that have been listening have sent me a DM, you've sent me an email, you sent me a WhatsApp message, you've screenshotted, you've shared it with somebody. And I really want to start this episode off with the weight of that and how much that truly means to me. I hope that whatever I do gives you food for thought, a little bit of inspiration, a different way of looking at things. So I want to start by saying thank you. Please keep it coming. Like, please. It also is beautiful to hear about what are the other topics you want me to discuss, what's going to help you the most, especially as well when it's in a solo episode. I feel like I've got such a long list in a really good, helpful way of topics I want to discuss, of doing things from different angles and new ideas. And especially as I evolve and grow, I want us all to grow together. Does that sound cheesy? I mean it, so tough. So please, this is my request to say, keep the love, but also the feedback coming. Am I missing stuff that, like, Amira, I've gotten through the season and like, I'm missing this. I want us to discuss this, or I'm having a challenging time about X. Do we also as well want should we say like a Q&A session? I would love to do that. If you have a question or a situation that you're struggling with, I would love for you to send it to me and I can talk about it anonymously. We can take out any like personal information, but I would love to be able to do an episode and go through some of your common questions, or we could do one per episode. Anyway, they were just some live ideas that actually genuinely just came to me. So if you would like that, let me know. The more feedback you give me, the absolute better. And also a big, huge, entire thank you from me, because I love having us all in this community together, and I want us in a space where we just continue to learn and grow from each other and celebrate each other. Like, yes, we want to hype each other up. So that's how we're starting this episode. All right, so earlier this month, if you are listening to this in real time, and you know I always say, if you land on this episode or this podcast and you're not listening in real time, it truly, truly does not matter. I just feel privileged that I get to keep you company on your journey, your commute. Somebody messaged and said that they've stopped their morning music for a podcast episode that happens to be mine. And that is lovely to hear. So if you're doing chores, if you've got it on your TV screen as you're cleaning your kitchen, that's because where my TV is, then I'm really, really feel so privileged to join you from wherever you are. So today's episode, yes, if you are listening in real time, then earlier this month, it was International Women's Day. And it's usually around this time of year that I probably get the most work-focused questions. Yes, particularly around women and being assertive and how you show up in the workplace, but also generally work questions. And I think probably something over the last year I speak a lot about when I go into companies is creating a psychologically safe environment, which we'll talk about more of in this episode. But I thought it might be quite a new, fresh way of doing this. I want to bring like a medley of topics to the table today. So I've picked 3 that kind of interlink to each other, kind of don't at the same time. But I wanted it to be like a medley of common workplace communication kind of focus situations that you tend to ask me and want a little bit of help or support or a framework around how to actually navigate it. So we are going to go through imposter syndrome. Now, I have talked about imposter syndrome before on the podcast. But like I said, I'm going to do things from a fresh angle, from a different perspective. And hopefully you'll still walk away with different tools that I perhaps haven't spoken about before. But if you've listened to that episode or you haven't, I'll link it in the show notes. You can always go back to it. Remember as well, as humans, we need to hear things more than once. So you might listen to an episode and be like, gosh, that really resonated with me. And then you need a reminder. So imposter syndrome, we're definitely going to delve into it. We want to do it from a slightly different angle. We're also going to talk about speaking up at work. And this is where I really talk about that psychologically safe environment. And you might say to me, but Amira, I'm in an environment where I don't feel that I can speak up. We're going to look at why. We're also going to look at when you do speak up and you're dealing with difficult people, what the hell do you do? I think a thing I get asked about as well is like, how do I say this in a really professional way without it backfiring on me? And there's a lovely, lovely woman on Instagram who's got an incredible account. I will tag her because I can't remember her name. She's got over like 2 million followers, and she does a lot around how to put your boundaries in at work, how to communicate those, and how to professionally say X, Y, Z. But she reenacts it, and it's a beautiful way to bring it to life. And then lastly, which I feel is going to be like a link on to what we've just spoken around speaking up and dealing with difficult people, we're going to be talking about those challenging conversations. And I want you to have a framework, and I really want you to understand, how are you in control of having this conversation? And I've had so many examples with clients this week where these conversations are not going well. And I can see it because we get heated in the moment, our emotions take over, and you expect the other person to do something and they don't. But let me not get into it now. That's your frame. This is going to be a little bit of a medley. So let's dive straight on in. So let's kick off with imposter syndrome. And I know sometimes I must sound like a broken record, but I hope when I say things, you know it came from my mouth because I bang on about it so much. I'm not the biggest fan of labels, and imposter syndrome is one of those phrases or labels that gets thrown around so much. And I think sometimes we can walk away with a misconception of it. Or I often get asked, Amira, actually, what is imposter syndrome? Can you actually break this down? Because I don't know if it's something that I'm experiencing or not. So imposter syndrome can come from so many different spaces. There's not just one place it can come from. It could be growing up. It could be you're facing a new challenge. Let me give you an example there because it's quite helpful. Imagine you've just gone through a breakup or a divorce. That could trigger those feelings of imposter syndrome. And sometimes it can come from this space of having so much expectation on your shoulders or your chest. I always point here because it usually feels like quite heavy. But I want to start off with imposter syndrome in a positive light, okay? Now, for some of us, we will experience imposter syndrome or those feelings of imposter syndrome on a consistent basis. And for some of us, we might experience it once in our life and then it doesn't come up again. Everybody's really different. And I know we can take some key examples, some key people. Michelle Obama is one significant person who's talked about this a lot. And she says that even now, she can sit at a table and feel those feelings coming up. So it's one to also normalize it and know that you aren't the only person experiencing it. But more importantly than that, I want us to take a mindset shift. I want us to reframe, because if you are feeling these feelings, you're probably doing a really good job. That's your sign, because usually you are doing something new or something that you haven't done before. So are those feelings of doubt going to come up? Are you going to question, can I really do this? Am I the right person for the job or for the task? Well, it's really completely valid. So rather than looking at it as something that's pulling you down or a negative, I want you to say, okay, well, I must be on the right lines. I'm doing something correctly if I am feeling these feelings. The trick is going to be, how do we manage this so it doesn't become all consuming and take over? So imposter syndrome is defined as this overwhelming feeling of not deserving the results or the success that you have. And so often it sounds like, and if you're a leader or a manager listening to this episode, I want you to look out for these signs within your team. And if you're not a leader or a manager, I want you to look out for this for yourself or even your peers as well. It will often sound like dismissing compliments. And I know my friends, if they're listening to this, will smile, because anytime I catch my friends saying something where they're dismissing themselves or putting it down to sheer and utter luck, I will usually catch them and get them to reframe it. So to recap, it will sound as though you're dismissing what you're good at. You will put things down to luck. Even, for example, let's say that you spent so much time working on a project and somebody gave you a compliment or was trying to recognize what you were good at, and you put it down to, oh no, it just wasn't a big deal, or it didn't even take me that long, but actually it really and truly did. Now that fear can also come from a space because you don't believe that you are perhaps as intelligent or perhaps even as creative as other people think you are. And I know for me, for a really long time, my imposter syndrome showed up as self-doubt. And this is why I'm not like the biggest fan of labels, because I don't walk around thinking I've got imposter syndrome or I feel like a fraud. But I doubted myself consistently. And I remember being very early on in my corporate career, one of my managers gave me such valuable feedback, not in the best possible way at all. I actually saw him recently and I shared that example with him. He said, "Did I say this?" I said, "Yes, you did." But it had a really profound impact on me. And he shared with me where I consistently was doubting myself and asking like the same questions again and again and again. And it's because I didn't trust my knowledge. I didn't trust that I knew enough. And I also, for a really long time, couldn't understand why people would hold me in a higher regard than I held myself. And so my self-doubt was chronic. I remember even like consistently working on this in my corporate career with a coach. And I naively thought, oh, I've nailed this. I'm never going to have to like deal with these feelings again. But what I've learned now is that the doubt will show up usually when I'm about to like level up, or usually when I'm on the cusp of doing something new and I'm like, oh, can we do this? Is this going to be good? And what I've learned to do over the years is catch it when I know I'm kind of on the cusp of it. When I think that it's going to creep in, okay, what am I doing differently? How am I managing that? And I think as well, even like the podcast is a really, really good example. 2 years ago, I didn't have a podcast, or maybe, just over 2 years. I think we've done 2 years now, but I didn't have a podcast. And if you go back and listen to season 1, I think you probably only need to listen to season 2 or 3, and you'd notice the difference in terms of how I have a conversation, how I show up. And I remember in the beginning, I had to really battle with, who's going to listen to this? Do I have anything valuable that I can really share? How is this going to help anybody? And that doubt just consistently showed up. However, I was at a stage where I got a lot better at dealing with it, and I knew the tools that would help me acknowledge the doubt and then still take action. And that was really important. And look, we're 5 seasons in, we're over 100 episodes. And then this season we're doing solo to the camera. But even that was a shift. I was doing something new. I'd never sat down to talk to the camera for this amount of time and make it engaging. I hope it's engaging. Guys, give me some feedback, please. You want to comment below, comment. If you're listening to it on Spotify, I get you can't comment. But that was new for me, and that was stepping out of my comfort zone. And then it was about acknowledging that doubt and saying, okay, well, what am I worried about here? What do I think is showing up for me? Why do I think that I won't be able to do this? And in the beginning, it was probably a little bit stilted. Now, as we're coming towards the end of the season, I can feel this shift in me. I can feel how I'm easing into it, how I feel a little bit more comfortable, how I'm finding my way of doing it. So my reminder to you is, you can have those feelings. Learning what to do with them and how to manage them in a very helpful, constructive way for you is how you keep showing up. It's how in your workspace, because I guess I'm really focusing on work here in honor of International Women's Day, and your workplace communication is really about how do you honor yourself and those feelings and still make sure that you don't miss out on those opportunities because you don't think you're good enough. So according to the Dunning-Kruger effect, it's usually the people that have high ability that have the low awareness of themselves. Now, this doesn't mean that every single person that falls into this category is going to experience imposter syndrome. And I do want to say that like not everybody does experience those feelings. I mean, if you listen to this episode, this is probably resonating in some way, shape or form for you. But I remember running a workshop and there was one person in this. It was an imposter syndrome workshop. And throughout the whole entire session, they just couldn't understand it. They couldn't wrap their head around the concept. And it's largely because they haven't ever experienced it. So generally speaking, about 70% of the population experience it at least once. And around the last stat I checked was around 60% of executives experience it as well. So I like to say, let's look at it as your sign that you're doing something new. Now, unless you really truly aren't qualified in something, or you perhaps haven't got the knowledge or the expertise that you need, if those feelings are creeping in, I wouldn't say that's imposter syndrome, but that's your sign that actually you need to do a little bit more work, or you need to learn something in order to be able to show up in a confident way. Now, another really common question I get asked before I'm going to take you through some tools when it comes to imposter syndrome is, Amira, is it true that this impacts more women than it does men or any other gender? Now, I'm going to give you the original research versus my opinion. So original research when it was done was that this only affected women. Now, since then, research has evolved to say, actually, this is not gender specific. I know when I go into a workplace, or especially a corporate setting, most of my sessions are filled with females. And so in that dynamic or that environment, I think it's probably heightened the most. But also sometimes I think that other people don't feel that they can voice it, or that they shouldn't have these feelings. And there are reasons why. There are a lot of statistics to say that women, generally speaking, do experience it more. But there's also a lot of newer research that shows that ethnic minorities also experience this more than any other groups. So there's just a few facts to kind of give you context of it. Now, I would say my one-to-one clients are a real mix. I've probably got a 50-50 split when it comes to gender. And I would say that regardless of gender, in some way, shape or form, it shows up for my clients. So I guess it's why I probably don't just hone in on it when it comes to women. Okay, so if you are struggling at the moment with feeling like you just aren't good enough at work or in your career, if you are doubting your decisions, if you feel like everything has to be perfect, and then when you make a mistake or you can't live up to your own high expectations, and yes, I said your own high expectations because I know they're self-induced, being harsh with you all today, then we need to look at changing that and doing things differently, because it's that perfectionism, it's that cycle of doubt, it's those feelings that keep you in that constant loop. So I'm going to take you through maybe 3 or 4 tools, 3 or 4 ways that you can do this differently. However, guys, this is your consistent action. This is something that you have to work at. And it will depend as well on like what's the severity or your level of imposter syndrome and these feelings showing up. Is it showing up in almost everything you do or say at work? Is it that actually it's only when you're dealing with perhaps senior executives within the team or the company? Or is it when you feel like you're out of your depth, or you've got other experts in the room that know more than you? Everybody's feeling around it is very, very different. So here's your tools to do things differently, but it's about consistent action. And this might take time, but if you let this fester, it's going to have such negative impact on how you feel about yourself. And also you're going to be missing out on opportunities, because you're going to be talking yourself out of these, maybe the next promotion, maybe leading on a project, maybe sharing your ideas in a team meeting. So I want you to think about doing this on a regular basis, please. Okay, now we know Amira's favourite topic, or one of Amira's favourite topics, is your negative self-talk. And I think it's because I think so much stems from this. I think there is not an episode or a workshop that I either talk about or I deliver where your negative self-talk doesn't come in some way, shape or form. So yes, I'm going to harp on about it till the end of time. And I hope that it resonates and that you can see and feel the difference. Now, I know as well that my negative self-talk still shows up. I'm not immune from it. I'm better at catching it. So when your feelings of imposter syndrome are kicking in, or especially if you've got those traits of perfectionism and you don't allow yourselves to make a mistake, and you're beating yourself up and you're criticizing yourself, but I really want to say you set yourself up to fail because you held yourself to such a high regard that it's really unlikely you're ever going to meet that. Then that negative self-talk kicks in and you tend to beat yourself up. You tend to think you should have done better. You tend to talk yourself out of the opportunity because you're not qualified. I did it with the podcast. Who's going to listen to me? I would like to think I've got an incredible podcast community. Imagine that I listened to that negative self-talk. Imagine that I didn't start a podcast. What then? So your first tool is to talk to yourself in the third person. It might feel weird. It might feel cringy. The reason for it is you get to separate yourself from the imposter syndrome. For a lot of us, we allow it to become part of our identity. And then it feels so difficult to change because you're like, but this is who I am. It's not. Like, I promise you to my absolute core, that is not who you are. You think it is, but we need to separate your identity from those feelings of imposter syndrome. So talking to yourself in the third person can really help you detach. So rather than feeling like, why did I do it that way? Or I should have known better, say, oh, why did that happen for them? And talk to yourself with that third person dialogue. Trust me on this one, please. Okay, tool number 2 is, this is an extension of tool number 1 actually, but if you are finding it difficult to do that and also you're in your head a lot, I always say, like, have your support system, have your people that can counteract that negative dialogue. Now, the goal is that you'll get to a space where you'll be able to do that for yourself. However, if you can't, a great tool is get other people to do that with you and for you. Okay, tool number 3. I love doing this with my clients, and damn do I see them struggle on it. And I'm giggling because I can on it, but I often get them to brainstorm their strengths and their weaknesses. Because if you are feeling like you don't deserve your success or the results that you're getting, is also a part of it, because there's many pieces of the puzzle here, but part of it is because you aren't recognizing your strengths and what you are good at. Now, this doesn't mean that I'm saying dismiss your weaknesses, don't work on those, but I do believe that if you can start to acknowledge what you do well, you might create enough space to start to welcome in the good things that you're doing, realizing that you do deserve them, and being able to, what I love to say, is step into your power. If my clients are listening, I know they're going to giggle because I say it to them all the time. So brainstorm. I want you to pause this episode. Pause right now. Unless you're driving, don't pause. But go and brainstorm your strengths and weaknesses. Now, what I will anticipate will happen is that you will struggle to write down what your strengths are. You might get a couple, if that. I don't think I've had any of my clients so far be able to come back with 10 things that they really celebrate about themselves, or the strengths at work that they're really, really good at. And it's usually why we do it together. And I understand that, but it comes from that space of where you've dismissed what you're good at, or you don't even recognize it as a strength because it comes so easily to you. But a great way to combat those feelings of not feeling deserving or good enough or worthy are to start to recognize, what are you good at? Okay, so tool number 4, which is the fourth and the last one I'm going to leave you with in this section, is, and this will massively apply to my perfectionists out there, or if you can really feel that the perfectionist traits are getting a hold of you, is I need you to challenge the goals that you are setting yourself. I really need you to do that for me, because if you continue to set these unrealistic goals, guess what? We're not getting out of this cycle of imposter syndrome. You're going to constantly fuel this dialogue that I'm not good enough, I'm always failing, I'm always making mistakes, why can't I get anything right? But guess what? That benchmark you set yourself was never realistic in the first place. So if you are struggling to look at those goals and think, well, it feels realistic to me, get somebody else that you trust to challenge that. So that's the toolbox I'm going to leave you with today. They are slightly different tools than I have shared with you on the podcast before. And I want you to pick one that resonates the most with you and go and try it. You know I'm about the practical side. So let me know how you get on with those tools. Okay, that's just section 1 of today's episode complete. I'm hoping you've got so many ideas and food for thought spinning around your mind. Now, section 2 and section 3, I don't know why I'm overusing my hands today, but here we are. Section 2 and section 3, or part 2 and 3 of this episode, majorly link in together. So part 2 was around a question I get asked a lot around, Amira, how do I get comfortable with speaking up at work? Now, depending on your personal experience, you're probably going to interpret that question quite differently. So for some of you, it will be about finding your voice, really leaning into your authenticity and building your confidence that your ideas and your opinions are valid. I actually just had a very similar conversation. So for some of you, it will be that. For others of you, it might be actually speaking up when things frustrate you or when they annoy you. And I've also had a recent conversation with actually one of my friends around this. This will kind of link into the third part when I talk about these challenging conversations. But for some of us, we'll find it more difficult to speak up to our boss at work, and maybe it's because it's the hierarchy. For some of us, we might find it harder to speak up with our peers because actually, are they going to take my ideas on board? Have I got enough credibility behind me? So you can see why I've done this medley of topics today. I really hope this flows when you listen to it. But those feelings of imposter syndrome can also filter in and trickle down into why we don't speak up or we find it harder to speak up. And then it will lead into, well, we're going to have these challenging conversations or not. So before we get into challenging conversations, where I'm going to give you a really, I think, a strong, beautiful framework to have these conversations, I want us to sit in, first of all, the space of why do we not speak up? And maybe it's something has upset us and actually we feel that we're going to be judged when we share that. And I've had a recent client session where, and this was actually a non-work situation, but something had really bothered them within a friendship and they wanted to address it. Now, they actually did end up addressing it, but they addressed it 3 weeks later. Now, usually when it comes to timing of these conversations and speaking up, there'll be a certain point where you'll miss the moment and it will be really difficult for you to have the conversation. Now, in this situation with my client, I'm really glad they still had it, even though it's 3 weeks down the line, because it was quite a heavy topic and it really was weighing heavy on their heart. And it was good for them to be able to trust their voice and trust their instinct. And it was also around creating their boundaries for how they wanted this friendship to move forward. However, generally speaking, I would say that if you're speaking up, if you want to have these types of conversations, not sooner is better, but try and have them in a timely manner. So sometimes it's okay to sleep on it. You don't have to react to something straight away. But equally, on the other side of it, we don't want to leave these types of conversations too long because sometimes so much time passes, it's quite difficult for the other person to receive it. So if we're taking it back to speaking up at work, I am a very, very big fan, as I said in the beginning, of creating what I love to call, it's not actually my terminology, but a speak up culture. And this really means around creating this psychologically safe environment at work where we can feel this isn't where we can just share ideas or share our opinion, but this is really around challenging that status quo, having hard conversations, giving feedback. And I've actually had a very recent conversation with a leader who wants to address something with his team member. And actually, within the organization, I don't quite believe, they're actually quite far away from it, that there's a psychologically safe environment. And they've been advised by other people to just let it go. And so what this does is that this doesn't foster an environment where we feel that there's trust and that there's safety. So there's two sides of this when I'm encouraging you to speak up at work and have these challenging conversations. It does come down to your culture. And I think it's why it's one of the things I'm so passionate about when I go into organizations is it takes all of us on an individual level and a collective level to think about the environment that we're fostering and what are we all doing as individuals to contribute to that. And it does take work and it does take commitment and it does take building habits. But if we want to get to that space where we feel that we can call out behavior that we don't like, that we can share feedback, we can challenge ideas, we can be innovative, we can move forward, then taking ownership of where we need to speak up is really important. But I do want to caveat that I understand that if you aren't in an environment where you feel like it's safe to do so, you aren't going to speak up. So a couple of tips I want to share before I kind of get into the mindset of this is sometimes you're going to speak up and you're going to be met with what we might want to label as difficult people. And so that can also make speaking up feel so incredibly challenging. But like everything that I say, practice is a really key part of this. And being able to start in small ways so that you know that it is doable. But as I've said already, if we are in unhealthy environments, it's going to feel harder than other situations. Now, a quick bit of research, I just want to slide into the conversation before I go through some practical points on this with you, is I was looking at research that was actually just done last year, and I'm going to see if I can link it and put it in the notes and give you a little bit more context around this. But they were looking at is creating a speak up culture and this psychologically safe environment, and what's one of the biggest things that kind of stands in our way at work. And the top reason as to why we don't feel that we can speak up is fear of the consequences. And I know that I've been in organizations where I felt it and other people have felt it as a collective. And I talk about it as it's the fear of the repercussion of, is this going to be held against me? Is this going to be damage the relationship going forward? Is this also going to impact maybe my performance review or even my pay and my bonus? So I love that there was actually really recent research done on this, because it supports this as well. Now, the other thing I also say that stops us speaking up is we don't always know how to have these conversations. So before we go through that framework, a few things I want to encourage you to do differently when it comes to speaking up is, the first thing is understand why. Like, why are you speaking up? Why do you want to have this conversation? And I want you to try and shift the focus from you to the other person. Like, why is this going to be beneficial? How is this going to enhance and help the way that you connect with each other, and also the way that this relationship is going to move forward? I also want us to think about shifting your mindset. It's easy to fall into the bracket or the category of, why should I speak up? Why should I bother? Nobody's going to even listen, or nobody's going to do something differently. And that might be true. And I can't guarantee you that it's not. But I want you to shift your mindset and reframe, because if we're constantly looking through the negative lens, then guess what? You're kind of fueling that cycle where that response is more likely to be negative. Now, whilst you can't control somebody else, you do have control over your mindset, the way you speak to yourself, your thoughts, your behaviors. And so I want us to feed this in here. So rather than thinking, why should I speak up? I want you to shift your mindset to the positive and say, okay, by speaking up, I might change X, or this could help this person, or I'm going to feel that I'm speaking and advocating for myself. So shifting your mindset around speaking up is really important. If you're looking at, why should I bother? Why should I do this? You're going to stay in that negative cycle, and it's going to feel more difficult than it actually is. This kind of leads on to the third thing, which is also taking the focus away from you. So think about how, by speaking up, are you serving or helping somebody else? And you might think, Amira, what are you talking about? But whether you're in a corporate environment, a different business setting, you're probably going to have a team of people, or you've got clients, depending on what your work world looks like. So I want to encourage you to think about, well, by speaking up and maybe sharing your ideas or challenging something, how is this helping maybe the collective, so maybe your team, or how is this encouraging and helping other people? But also, how is it then feeding into this culture of being able to speak up and create this safe space of trust and connection? And the last and final thing, which I know I have already touched on, but just to kind of like reiterate and close it off, is in order to change how you feel about speaking up, you have to be able to practice that and take some sort of action. So as I like to say, and I've actually said this recently this week to one of my clients, is start with a really small step, because I don't want your nervous system shocked. I don't want you to feel like it's so out of your depth that you then retreat and you never want to do it again. And we can be reconditioned. Our brains can be reprogrammed. You know, it's one of my favorite sayings. So whilst you're thinking about challenging your mindset, you also have to do something differently. You have to take action. And yes, you might feel scared. It might feel like the biggest thing you've done, but I promise you, do it enough and it will build that. And I use the example, which I don't think many people believe, but if you look back at the beginning of my corporate career, which probably was about 15 years ago, I hate to admit that, I couldn't stand up in front of a group of people. So let's take my team in a team meeting, who I worked with every day. I couldn't stand up and share an idea or put my opinion across without going bright red. And all I'd want to do is completely like shrink into the seat and walk out of that meeting. And now look at what I do. So that's evidence that it can change. Okay, so the last and final piece I want to leave you with in this episode today is around having these challenging conversations, which speaking up as well might feel very, very interlinked to this. Now, challenging conversations tend to, at the moment, I can see themes coming through with my clients, whether it's around money, whether it's around pay rises at work, whether it's around even things like maternity leave, whether it's around holiday, whether it's around bonus and promotion. These tend to be a lot of the challenging conversations at work, even as well like performance conversations. That's come up really recently. So I want to take you through a framework that's going to help set you up in a really positive way to have these conversations. This does not mean, please don't get this twisted, this does not mean that I am guaranteeing the conversation will go well. You are not in control of how the other person is going to receive the conversation, but there are some key things along the way as to why challenging conversations or difficult conversations don't go well. It's as simple as that. And I've seen it play out this week, more or less in real time. So the first thing before I'm going to get into the actual framework is when we're going into these hard conversations, a huge piece that you need to own is what you're feeling, what stories you're telling yourself, and asking yourself, how are you taking ownership of making sure that your emotions and your feelings don't take over the conversation? Now, this does not mean that I am saying you can't have feelings and you can't have emotions, but how helpful are they to that conversation? How much are they overtaking the conversation? It's your responsibility to look at those feelings that are coming up, to understand where they're coming from, and then to really think about, okay, well, actually, what's the story I'm telling myself that might be unhelpful? And actually, Marissa Peer has a beautiful technique. I actually use this in my personal relationship and my romantic one. And I honestly think it's such a game changer, because a lot of us will walk around with assumptions, or somebody at work didn't do something and then you're criticizing them, you think they're lazy. And if you stop, and you can write this down, or you can just say this to yourself out loud, or say it to somebody else, the tool is, the story that I'm telling myself is. And saying it out loud can help you acknowledge, where am I making an assumption? Where have I assumed that my team member didn't do a piece of work because they're lazy and they don't care and they're being nonchalant about something? Or even try it with your partner. It's really incredibly powerful. So part of having challenging conversations is mastering your own emotions and these stories and the narrative that you are telling yourself. Can we see if we can put that down before we go into these types of conversations? So let's dive into our framework. Now, challenging conversations can sometimes end up in conversations that feel like there's so much friction, there's tension, but essentially what I call a conflict conversation. And it can escalate quickly. You can wonder where you've gone wrong. So the first thing I want you to think about when you're going into these conversations is, what are you feeling and how are you sharing how something has impacted you when you're having this challenging conversation? Because often what we do is we point the finger, or we blame, or we make a comment about their behavior, which is very, very subjective. So you may have heard me say before that saying you did this, or you made me feel a certain way, or your behavior here was unacceptable, isn't actually going to drive a helpful, healthy conversation. If we switch that around and really go in from the angle, I feel not thought about. I feel that I wasn't very important. I feel left out. It's a really different, powerful way of sharing how you feel. And yes, it takes trust. And yes, it takes vulnerability. But you're more likely for that other person to actually hear the message and let it land. And I know that I've recently had probably 2 conversations, and somebody actually had this conversation with their manager. And their manager was the one speaking to me and said, I had no idea that I said this and then they took it in this way. And by them having this conversation with me, it means I can go and do something differently. So whilst not every conversation is going to end in that way, it is really important for you to own how you feel. Now, the other part of this, or your second F, is the facts. We often forget to be really specific about what's happened. And so it's helpful to take it back to a scenario or a situation. So it might be, when we last caught up, we discussed XYZ. Like, that's your fact. And you want to keep it to the point, because there's less chance of the other person getting defensive. There's less chance of the other person arguing. So think about owning your feelings. Do not point the finger and put the blame onto them. Think about the facts of the situation. And then the last piece of having these conversations that we often forget is, how do we want to move forward from this? So make a suggestion. It doesn't always have to be the right one. It might take both of you to have this type of conversation and find a new way of working and going forward. But I want to remind you that you can't go through your whole entire work life and not have a challenging conversation at some point. But it is around understanding what are those stories that you're telling yourself, and how can you use this framework to help you prepare for it, but also so you can go into that situation where hopefully you're going to get a better response. Guys, thanks for joining us for another conversation this week. You know the deal by now, so please hit subscribe, leave a review. Don't forget to share this with a friend. And if you want to come and hang out with me, then click Instagram. You'll find me at _communication expert.